Today, I'd like to share some thoughts on what I call living from a sense of call and response. This is something that developed out of my mentoring work and just out of some reflection on how I tend to practice in my life, how I tend to use mindful awareness, not so much in the formal session as I tend to follow more Buddhist structure in my formal practice. But more in my informal practice when I'm in the world, when I'm in communication and conversation with others, when I'm just, wandering around the house or walking around the neighborhood or, whatever it is, going to the store, traveling. And this thought came to me that a lot of the mindful awareness that I apply in my daily life outside of a formal meditation session when I'm, sitting there with the time allotted for that, is this sense of deep listening. And so I've been reflecting on, what deep listening means for me, what listening means outside of, what we normally do is, listening with our ears. How do we listen with our eyes, our heart, our bodies, and of course, as a meditator, how do we listen with mindful awareness? So mindful awareness is that capacity of the mind that we all have. It's an innate or natural capacity or quality to be watchful or bear witness in its most raw sense, where our judgment, once we've strengthened mindful awareness, our judgment tends to reduce a little bit. We tend to be able to see a little bit more clearly how something is arising. I'm not saying I see clearly all the time or that's the case all the time, but I've just noticed that becomes there's less and less bias, less and less judgment when applying mindful awareness, right? Of course, it's challenging to apply it because we have to remember it and then we have to have that strong enough from the formal practice to be able to bring that into our daily life. But nonetheless, I going back to this sense of listening, we can use mindful awareness to listen because it's the mind in its raw nature that knows what's happening around us and within our own mind. But again, the judger or the commentator, or that one who is always trying to control the situation or name it or put it in a box, that kind of over time that takes a side seat, like I was saying. Then we can learn to listen to the raw sound of our experience, be that an internal one or like an internal experience or an external one, people around us, the vibe, the energy in the room, the body language of people, all that. And this gives us more wherewithal in how we want to respond to a particular situation, whether we're alone with ourselves in a thought or an emotion or with others, right? So there's a lot of agency that this can bring. There's a lot of efficacy this can bring in finding more joy, connection, harmonious relationships in our lives. So for me, this is like a real core practice that I use. So the sense of listening, I was reflecting on it deeper and, starting to relate it to the title of this episode, living from a sense of call and response. And I started to really reflect on my time as a musician. I still play from time to time, but I'm not an active professional musician, but I was for a long time. Some of you know I grew up with a father who was a touring jazz bassist, and he taught me a lot about music and the culture and history of jazz and all that. And so I grew up listening to the jazz greats from a young age and trying to understand the culture of jazz through the music. And one of the first things I was taught was to listen. More than like play the right notes or be a badass at your instrument. And the first thing my dad and other teachers of mine taught me was to listen. All forms of music require listening. and have a sense of call and response. But I would say any music that's derived from the African subcontinent tends to have much more of a call and response dynamic to the exchange with other musicians. And often in traditional like folk African music, it's with dancers and other things going on. So it's not just music alone. It's community, actually, in a way. We could probably look at it that way from modern Western culture. But anyways, so I quickly gained a passion for the tradition of jazz, and that brought me into other forms of percussion. I was a drummer mainly on the drum set, but then I started to eventually get interested in forms of African percussion and music, also forms that came from Africa into the African diaspora. You find in Afro-Cuban music, Afro-Brazilian music, so all of that. And when you study these styles of music, there's a heavy sense of call and response. The music is based on that. Actually, you hear it directly. It's just obvious because you have maybe singers and they're responding to a rhythm that was just produced from the drummers and vice versa and back and forth. And there's an incredible beauty in witnessing this and the energy it brings to you, the connection it brings you into. And of course, it's something that, is not necessarily natural to people who didn't grow up in cultures with this kind of music, dance, etc., song. And so often we have to learn call and response. And I remember being in jazz groups in both in college and before college. I went to a music school, and if I wasn't listening, people know. If I wasn't listening, I was disconnected from the other musicians, and it just didn't go well, for me or the others, right? So in a way, what we're talking about here with call and response, bringing it from this kind of metaphor analogy of music traditions, especially jazz and anything deriving from the African diaspora, you have embedded in it, in my opinion, this sense of curiosity, openness, generosity, and empathy, right? Because we're recognizing immediately within a music group, at least, we're in a community. And it's not just about my greatness or my goodness as a musician or me playing the best, shit possible. Actually, my best shit doesn't happen if the band isn't also doing their best, right? So there's automatically this sense of generosity and, like I said, in connection. And I would say it's like the antithesis of individualism, which often creates a lot of emotional problems for us these days. A lot of our isolation is derived from individualism being seen as something we should make more, and that it's, incredibly important to be the individual. Now, we are all individuals. That's fine too. But we also need to learn to work together and to listen and to be open, curious, and generous with one another. Otherwise, we're going to be quite lonely, quite isolated. And actually, if you just study the history of humans, we probably won't be able to survive that long. So none of us are completely disconnected, even if we'd like to be. So anyways, relating this back to the Dharma and to meditation, I started to think of this as this sense of, well, how has meditation for me become call and response? And I would say initially it wasn't. It was an incredibly selfish pursuit, a pursuit, which isn't wrong in the beginning, because often we just have to focus on ourselves to, we're shining the light here. And that's not easy to do. It's not easy to gain facility in mindful awareness. That takes time, right? That takes often years for most of us. And facility here just means some ability to rest in awareness or to sustain it or to stabilize it, or some people might say concentration or something like that. I more talk about the stabilization of awareness or the sustaining of it. And so the path might start off that way, but at a certain point, we don't want our path, our spiritual path or meditation cut off from the world. That's not the point, first of all. And also it's very isolating and painful. And so when I started to apply this same concept that I was working with as a musician and cultivating as a musician to my meditation practice, specifically, I would say not in the formal session, but in the world, in communication with others, When something goes wrong between me and a friend or me and a partner or whatever, like, what is that, and there's my response, which is often can be fear or regret or confusion or anger. Sometimes there's my internal response, and then there's the external situation, what's going on, their fear, their anger, their reaction, right? And so I started to think of call and response in this form of practice as more of a sense of interdependence, or a sense of the connections we have with everything around us. And if we listen deeply, we can start to tune in to the responses we're getting from the world, right? The responses we're getting in our relationship. And I mean this, in the broadest sense. Like, a response could be no response. A response could be body language, right? A response can be someone's overwhelm that is maybe not related to us, but other dynamics in their life. And we get caught in that as well. And this isn't just with people. This can be in our work. This can be in our relationship to money, to body image, to anything, actually, just anything we experience. So it's quite broad how we can apply this. But what we're doing is we're learning to listen through awareness, basically, as we strengthen it. That raw sense of knowing, that raw sense of being able to bear witness with the mind, or be watchful with the mind. And we're first listening to the response, and then we can have the call, meaning that's our actions we take, right? That's how we engage with the world. And we engage based off of a response. But now, because the mindful awareness is being centered, that engagement is much more connected, right? It's much more, that engagement is much more, again, open, curious, generous. I would even say, like, it can be compassionate, because we're not just interested in just, yelling a bunch of crap out there, in a sense, calling or speaking or not speaking, whatever we're doing as an action, right? Which sometimes non-action is action. Whatever we're doing, we're becoming conscious of, because we're noticing the response in the world. Now, again, there's a whole conversation here we could have. I'm not going to have right now about, we can be hypersensitive to that, the feedback we're getting from the world. And that's maybe not what I'm suggesting here, because we first have to become sensitive to, not hypersensitive, but sensitive to our own call and response internally, right? Because when we do something, there is a response internally. There's a response in the mind. There's an emotional response sometimes, right? So I'll give you an example, just really simple. We didn't get enough sleep because we decided to stay up till 3 or 4 in the morning last night. There you go. There's a response to that, not just physically, but emotionally. So even with things like that, but of course, I'm also talking on a more subtle level of learning to listen and flow and be open and be curious to trying different things, with obviously an intention of compassion and an intention to connect deeper with ourselves and the world around us. So I just wanted to kind of put this out there, as it's something I am just noticing I'm using a lot in my own work, like with myself and with others around me and my daily activities. I'm also starting to share it with mentees I work with one-to-one. And perhaps I'll develop some more content on this, but I just wanted to share it and put it out there and see, like, is this something useful to you? Is this something that's landing? Is it too abstract what I'm talking about? Do you have a practice of this already? If you're meditators out there, let me know if you want to hear more about this kind of stuff. I'd love to organize it more and then share it. So yeah, let me know in the comments below if you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Spotify or iTunes. Please feel free to message me at scotttusa.com. Let me know your thoughts and feedback. I'd appreciate it. All right. Thanks so much.